It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our tonight's speaker, Jeffrey Schnapp. And this evening is part of the Northeastern Information Design Lecture Series in partnership with Northeastern Center for the Arts. And just as a reminder, we have two more talks as part of this series put together for the Information Design Lectures, and that's next week. We have on November 5th, Richard Saul-Worman and Alan Hasselfeld, who's the CEO of Hasbro, and then the following week, our final presentation will be Ben Schmidt from the NEU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks. So to remind you about those upcoming talks. But again, I'm very happy to be introducing Jeffrey Schnapp. My own introduction to his polymath thinking and compelling writing came through a 2011 article published in Modern Language Quarterly, evocatively titled "The Chatter of People and Things." And one of the skills that I think Jeffrey has is great evocative titles. It's definitely an underrated skill. He starts this text with what I have come to regard as his signature methodology that he has advanced throughout different phases of his work. And that is identifying an intellectual trait, a cultural form or function that is so ubiquitous, so pervasive that we often do not even recognize it as such. Schnapp's careful and sustained analysis then, in turn, makes us see this facet in a central or pivotal moment, often defining an entire epoch. The chatter, or people and things, exemplifies this approach. He starts the piece by giving us a list of lists and euphemisms for the process of list making, catalogs, inventories, alphabets, and other examples of paper, scrolls, scraps filled with names, places, dates, plants, and more esoteric enumerations, touching on everything from religion to theater. All as a means of underscoring his broader claim that enumerations are the focal point of what he precisely identifies as the didactic urge in the Western literary imagination, an object of appetite for increasingly complex modes of ordering, chronological, symbolic, or logical. All of this ordering, Schnapp tells us, is to stave off the noise, the informational flotsam and jetsam. The compunction is not just to enumerate and record, but make sense in doing so, all for the aim of averting the certainty of erasure and loss. The very gesture of recording and having been recorded confers value, writes Schnapp, adding the poignant rejoinder seemingly aimed at the rise of the field of data visualization and the impetus for this series of talks that we're all gathered here for tonight, that, quote, data trash is unimaginable before the industrialization of printing. I circle back to this text this evening for several reasons. And of course, I can list them for you, right? The first is the task of introducing a speaker is not that different or unlike taking inventory or taking stock of Jeffrey Schnapp's many roles and the titles that he's held. There are the academic positions, starting with his current dual roles at Harvard that he has occupied since 2011. And that is the faculty director at the Meta Lab, which provides a platform for experimental scholarship on the history and documentation of network culture, and as faculty co-director of the Berman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard's Law School. So this summer, this is actually where I met Jeffrey Schnapp, when I participated in the Getty-funded Digital Art History Consortium organized at the Meta Lab. And I was introduced to the lab's improvisatory and idea-driven ways of approaching scholarly puzzles through digital projects. And one manifestation of their work was a demonstration that was given to us on Curarium, a web-based platform to interface with collections, an animated archive designed to serve as a model for crowdsourcing, annotation, curation, and augmentation of works within and beyond their respective collections. And simultaneously, as scholars, curators, designers gathered at their space on Gardner Street for 10 hot days, our projects benefited from Meta Lab's patented techniques of inducing creative collaboration through the masterful use of highly sophisticated and advanced technologies such as Legos, index cards, Sharpies, and thumbtacks, and folding chairs, lots of folding chairs, and chalkboards. I read these gestures as part of Schnapp's interest in eschewing the fool's game of prognosticating in the future for the lessons he has advanced through his own scholarship on Italian futurists and their futurist laboratories, for the development of a communication medium or communicative medium that reflected its own period using simple, direct means of address. Before joining Harvard, Schnapp founded and led the Stanford Humanities Lab between 1999 and 2009. In addition, he was the Perotti Chair and Professor of French and Italian and Comparative Literature at Stanford. The methodological range of his publications is a direct reflection of his interests, which remain, in my opinion, characteristically paradoxical in their breadth and coverage, traversing antiquity to the present, encompassing Dante, fascist culture, the material history of literature, 20th century architecture and design, the cultural history of science and engineering, and not least the emergence of digital humanities. See, I told you tonight would be this, right? And these particular roles have been well documented and recorded. In fact, that was the kind of bio that was sort of sent around. Less enumerated, less documented are other practices that Schnapp has engaged, including his experiments with mixed reality approaches to exhibition design and organization through his acclaimed work as a curator who has collaborated with the Triennale di Milano, the Cantor Center for the Arts at Stanford, the Wolfsonian at the Florida International University, and the Canadian Center for Architecture. And as an art historian, I can't help but to highlight, or maybe it is like, as Jeffrey tells us, the didactic urge, to recount an interesting interview in 2009 published in the Journal of Italian Studies, in which he confesses how his literary pursuits actually took a backseat to his art practice, outlining during his BA studies in Vassar's first fully coeducational class, and later when he was a lecturer at the University of Nice, he mostly produced large abstract puzzle paintings based on projected drawings. Yes, he was an artist. And he also read art form assiduously, especially, he says, the criticism of Max Kozlov and Brian O'Doherty. So I knew there were some other connections to be made there. In this interview, he outlines how there was never a coherent plan or vocational ambition, but only a loose constellation of linguistic, artistic, and literary interests. These so-called loose interests have obviously coalesced into piercing texts that have cut through the dense noise in all of our fields, offering clarion arguments in book form. Most recently, these included the titles The Electric Information Age book, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2012, the same year that he released two other book projects, Italian America II and Moderna Italia, a collection of essays on 20th century Italian literature, design, and architecture. Digital Humanities came out by MIT Press in 2012, written with Ann Burdick, Joanna Drucker, Peter Lingenfeld, and Todd Pressner, and most recently, The Library Beyond the Book, published by Harvard University Press this year, which is an experimental book co-authored with Matthew Battles, his partner in crime at MetaLab, that explores future scenarios for libraries in the digital age, the subject of his talk tonight at Northeastern. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, with such a glorious and generous introduction, I can only disappoint, but I'll do my best to limit the level of disappointment. But thank you so much for the invitation, Mari Sabel, Gloria, for the introduction. And what I would like to do today is to talk about this book, which is a recently published book, but to talk about it in its context, because one of the key elements in the way that it approaches the question of the present and particularly the future of libraries is really to ask the question of the library in terms of one of the fundamental sort of particularities of the library with respect to the kind of architectural history and typology that it belongs to, which is it goes deep into the history of libraries itself. In terms of, is the fact that libraries, perhaps unique to unique at least in the catalog of structures that have a very deep and long-standing history with respect to the architectural record, are uniquely edifices where the contained and the container are in a kind of circular loop. The very word biblioteca, which is the at the root of the words in at least the Romance languages and a number of other languages that describes what a library is a word that in its most rigorous original sense refers to a case for an object. And the kind of intertwining between the contained and the container is really very much the way in which Matthew and I try to approach the history of libraries, but with a kind of speculative gaze. Digging, excavating deep in the past of the history of this interesting loop structure between containers and the contained, and trying to track how the shifting media history of the contained shapes in turn the shifting nature of the container and the way in which the institution is understood, positioned socially, the way it interacts with other kinds of institutions and structures. But I wanted to say, just by way of a preface, that The Library Beyond the Book is a book itself that is part of a series, and this series is itself a kind of experiment with the contained. That is to say, it might seem strange for somebody who is often referred to or thought of as a digital humanist or somebody who's played a lead role in the digital arts and humanities to say, but I truly believe that one of the great and really exciting challenges of the present for, if you like, the digital humanities, let's call it that, is precisely reimagining what print culture can do or should do in the kind of expanded media universe that makes up our time today. So the MetaLabs project series, which is the series that these books belong to and that the Library Beyond the Book belongs to, is really an attempt to kind of experiment with what it would look like to reimagine the scholarly book, forms of scholarly argument, in ways that might change the audience of scholarly books, might also allow us to rethink the position that print artifacts and print culture occupies vis-a-vis other channels and spaces and modes of communicating knowledge, and also maybe crack open a feature of print culture that I think was always open, but it was relegated to being a kind of secondary feature of the print universe, which is the notion that that maybe print forms could be less product-oriented and more process-oriented, that books might no longer be thought of as the end product of a long research trajectory that gets finalized and is established for eternity, or at least that's the fantasy, right? As a print artifact that maybe it gets corrected at most with a few errata slips, but that basically is stable for, if not eternity, then at least a few centuries, to a model where print is a moment in a larger set of operations, where it's in a dynamic relationship with a whole series of other channels, other places, media for conveying, communicating, and engaging in knowledge sharing. So the series is itself an experiment, and the other books in the series are all books that play with a template that is largely borrowed from the kind of McLuhan sort of late 60s, early 70s experimental paperback playbook, which is something I've been interested in as a cultural historian. These are books that, for instance, that they try to have it both ways. They play with weaving together short forms of argument with long forms. The classic print culture genres that have defined the modern university have been largely focused on long forms of argument. The scholarly monograph is, of course, the kind of crystallization of that idea. But the scholarly monograph has not really undergone a redesign process at any point during its history, as far as I can tell. And so I think it's overdue for a kind of facelift, a kind of digital era facelift. So these books have at their core a kind of classic essay, an argumentative essay, but they are prefaced by and followed by hybrid visual verbal arguments, forms of argument. And they also have these insertions, which we call windows, you can see, in all of them, that are little micro arguments that essentially approach or engage a topic at a different level of granularity than the overarching argument. So it's a kind of experiment in forms. This is an example of a window. This is a purely visual argument, replicates the content that's in the HyperCities environment, which is a project that was actually born at the Stanford Humanities Lab back in the distant, in 1999, God forbid, but that then went to UCLA and has been supported largely by UCLA, but also forms a visual argument where image sequences make points that are embedded in the text. There's nothing radical or new about these notions. They've been features of experimentation with print as a medium, with the codex form as a medium. But they haven't been features of scholarly argument and that includes also mixing the languages of code with the languages with natural languages. It includes trying to think about productive ways to create frictions, if you like, between very short forms of communication, ways of capturing, in a sense, documenting processes that are massively multi-authored, you might say, like how an event, for instance, resonates across an entire community. In this case, some of these forms of documentation have to do with the use of the HyperCities platform as a way of leveraging the power of documenting the way in which social media have transformed the nature of political activism and communication. Thinking about the way in which the page is itself a theater that can be used for its expressive powers. The increasing, growing importance of data visualization tools and graphical techniques as a mode of interpretation and argumentation that can be integrated into extended narrative, more traditional forms of argumentation, and so forth. I just give you this kind of inventory of elements just to suggest that the library book is doing many of these same kinds of things in its own way, really trying to imagine the ways in which a print artifact might intersect with, be at the center of a process, not just be a product of a kind of research outcome, if you like. And indeed, this book is a book that was literally directly born out of my own work as the faculty director of MetaLab. It goes back to two sort of coinciding contextual factors. I'm not a librarian and I'm not an architect, but I'm deeply interested in the whole question of how we weave together information and space. And it's always seemed to me that there is no place that better crystallizes the challenges as well as the opportunities for weaving together in a deep sense information and space than the library. In a sense, libraries have been doing this for tens of centuries. And in a lot of the contemporary conversation about the present and future of libraries, there's a kind of tendency to move towards a kind of binaries that are extraordinarily reductive, sort of all books or no books, right? That's the library of the future. The techno sort of utopians say, well, we already have libraries that are 100 times bigger than the library of X, Y, or Z. Some of them start with Alexandria, others talk about the Library of Congress. As if the choices that faced us were so reducible to such simple kinds of alternatives. It was sort of in the context of that debate within the design community, the architectural community, but also more broadly, the kind of sense of anxiety, of crisis within the librarianship community that a debate was taking place on the Harvard campus, which was related to the attempts to essentially consolidate the 70 plus, some people say 90 plus libraries that make up the Harvard library system. I would put the word system into scare quotes there. And somehow make them talk to one another. These are libraries that run the gamut from being libraries of seeds, like Herbario. We have 3 libraries dedicated exclusively to collecting seed samples, some of them in the range of 1 million objects that are collected there. 2 music libraries, ethnographic libraries, classical kind of universal type libraries like Widener. In other words, this very heterogeneous universe with very different cultures of librarianship, and the sense of kind of panic, crisis that accompanied a lot of these discussions, which it seemed like there was really an opportunity to create a different kind of conversation, a conversation that would also bring designers into that conversation, to people involved not just in talking about policy, what a library should be or what it shouldn't be, but also what do we want a library to be? Like what are the kinds of forms of, what are our expectations, our needs, where are the areas of opportunity, where are places where we can intervene and start to think about models that really respect also the reality of the history of libraries, which has always been a reality of hybridity, of multimediality, but understood under very different sets of conditions. And a constantly shifting picture, not a picture where any given iteration of what a library is the true and only standard, the library with a capital L. And so it was in this context that MetaLab started a series of design studios. The first one was called Biblioteca, naturally, sort of the book and the bookcase. And that evolved into Library Test Kitchen. And Library Test Kitchen has gone on for a couple of years. And what Library Test Kitchen was, as the playful name suggests, an opportunity to create a space where a community of librarians, designers, big thinkers, people interested in this whole problem of how information and space can productively live together. And of course, the library is not the exclusive place where this question is posed, but it's a privileged place alongside classrooms, alongside other kinds of learning and knowledge-rich environments. And to become engaged in not just in some speculative thinking, but also kind of propositional thinking, to actually try serious but also crazy things out, to user test them, to do everything from think about ways of reimagining policies to reimagining the physical design of furnishings, of spaces, at every level of the scale, sort of from building all the way down to like carpeting and backup, you know, or no, actually the down would be all the way down to the book, right? Or to the document, or to the object, all the way back up to the 5,000-foot view, you know, to really and do so in a kind of design thinking way, not just debating about yes or no with books, without books, with, you know, but trying out, testing out, playing, being propositional. And so it was in the context of Library Test Kitchen really that this book came about. Matthew Battles and I, Matthew was himself a librarian at the Houghton Library, the Rare Book Library at Harvard. He's a writer with a deep history of engagement precisely with the historiography of libraries, the kind of stories that they tell, that their history tells. And we just felt that there was really an opportunity to write a different kind of a book than the books that people write from within the library studies community, but also different from the kinds of books that people write from within the architectural history or similar community. And to bring together these two dimensions, the contained and the container, as a part of a kind of fluid, a more fluid history. And it was in that context that one of my lifetime ambitions, which is to have a serious scholarly book that begins with a cartoon and has been fulfilled. And we decided that it would be nice, one of our heroes in the story that we try to tell is Melville Dewey. Now, many of you may know Melville Dewey as the inventor of the Dewey Decimal System, which was one of the great, but mind you, one of the many classificatory systems that in the course of the creation of modern libraries as institutions established itself. And each of those classificatory systems, as as librarians know better than the rest of us, is itself a kind of vision of the world. It isn't simply an attempt to try to create order out of a world of too much information. It is also quite literally a kind of mapping of knowledge fields. It's a mapping of the terrain of the earth. It's everything you want in Harvard has its own eccentric system that's still preserved in parts of Widener Library, and the biggest category is Ottoman Empire, just to give you a feel. And if you know, as some of you may be familiar with even the Library of Congress system, which is a much more recent system, a system that's displaced our friend Melville Dewey's this perfectly scientific universal system that dates back to the late 19th century. In the Library of Congress system, there are entire categories that had to be constantly invented and re-embedded to make sense of how these taxonomical schemes always reduce the complexity of the world, cannot anticipate developments like birth control, for example. Where does birth control belong in the taxonomy of the Library of Congress system? Well, there's actually a very interesting sort of anecdotal trail that will tell you about how this decision was made. So we decided it would be fun to start this book, which is about a kind of deep archaeology of the library as an institution that uses kind of a sort of real engagement with these different pasts that make up the history of the library as a kind of point of entry to a series of speculative scenarios about what libraries are emerging as, what they could become, and what they might become. So we begin with this cartoon, which we scripted and a comic artist, Joe Alterio, drew for us. So we have this story, and this is actually a real quote The old-fashioned novel is really dead, and nothing can revive it or make anybody care for it again. Think of some of our techno-utopians of today, right? The literature of the future might turn out to be the daily exchange of ideas for men of genius over the everlasting telephone, of course, published every morning for the whole world. Now, this is actually a quote from a letter that was written to the founder of your museum, Isabel Stewart Gardner, from a correspondent of hers. And these were the techno-utopians of the turn of the 19th century. They truly believed that the telephone was going to be this instrument in this world of overwhelming information that would simplify and deliver instantaneous literary experience, and that the codex was gone and buried, it was of the past. So we wrote this little parable, which is simply a reminder of how these kinds of fantasies of one medium substituting another are just that, they're fantasies. The reality of media revolutions is always one of overlap, of repositioning, of a kind of complex layering that happens. And institutions, particularly institutions in the business of learning and knowledge sharing and production, are always part of that process of hybridization, of rewrapping, repackaging, the one shaping the other. So here we have our gentleman who is, one of these people who puts libraries on extinction lines. That 5 years out, 10 years from now, the last library will close its doors. Believe me, you can find them on the web. There's plenty of them. Are futurists. And we have Melville Dewey comes along and says, "Dead? That's not how it works, my good man. That's not what a library is for." And our gentleman says, "Well, please excuse me." And Melville goes on to say, as a matter of fact, the library you see is a palimpsest. What? Why? The past, present, and future mingle. Come along. Oh dear. And so we have them go off in one of those classic capsule tubes that were used. In fact, if you go to many libraries today, there's still instant information systems that are in use that use essentially pneumatic tubes to send messages through the building. And he goes off on a little bit of a time travel, right? Okay, we already read this. And so here we are in our little time capsule, and we go back to, in a sense, the founding library of most library history narratives, which is either Pergamon or Alexandria, but Alexandria in this case. And our gentleman here, Isabel Stewart Gardner's correspondent, says, "But I thought it was destroyed." Well, indeed it was. It was burned up, torn down, rubbed out more times than I care to catalog. But here's what makes a palimpsest. Traces of the past remain for the present to consider. Old ways talk to the new. Much is lost, to be sure, but things survive, added to and transformed. Buildings fall before tyrants and mobs, but the books turn to each other and whisper. And then we have him being kicked in kind of nice hieroglyphic form out back into his tube, and off we go on our next journey forward into the centuries in our time machine, and we arrive at a kind of glorious version of the Library of St. Gallen, the great northern Swiss monastic library, and we're in a medieval scriptorium, and we see that the library doesn't look at all like it looked in Alexandria. This is now a world where, not of scrolls, of volumina, but rather of codices. In this case, we've made it to a moment when print culture is coexisting with forms of manuscript-based practice, and we have a whole series of pieces of furnishing, a kind of infrastructure that's been created to allow for a very distinctive, culturally constructed concept of what it is to read and to copy and to perform works, to interpret them. That's, of course, based on ideas about piety and sacred, the study of the sacred. And here, then we have in the final episode of this cartoon, which I don't want to linger over, our techno-utopian being projected out into the year 2100, and here we have a kind of deliberately, it looks a little bit like a Marriott already, today, and now his texts are being delivered in electronic form, but guess what? People are still doing something that looks recognizably like reading to us. It isn't a kind of total transformation of the nature of. And Melville Dewey is the hero of this story in part because Melville Dewey is a figure who comes back in this book over and over again. Because not only did he develop the Dewey Decimal System, but he also built an entire empire out of the furnishings that still make up many of our libraries to this day. Many of the basic features, the desk structures, the kind of reference desk materials, many of the tools, much of that infrastructure was part of his vision of a future library, a library that was had, for instance, one of his major kind of pet projects was the simplification of spelling, to rationalize English spelling, hopeless task, of course. And that was part of this kind of global modernizing project. So we see him as a figure whom we want to recover here, in part because he represents a figure who really thought about the library as an institution at every single scale of that granularity, from the big policy questions. He wrote about mobile libraries, all the way down to the stamp, the rubber stamp that will have on it both the date and a pen, so that the librarian can write the name of the person who's taking out a book. And in that sense, it's this sense of design imagination, of applied to the library across all of these scales that interest us. And the book tries to do that through, as I said, again, a structure that's not unlike the structure of those other books, with a classical essay, which starts with a kind of sweeping framing of the argument, then is punctuated by a series of windows that are little micro-histories of specific attributes that have been defining pieces of equipment, if you like, defining features of the library over the course of this 20th century history. And then the second half of the book is largely dedicated to 6 scenarios, which we think are scenarios we're thinking about, that are extracted from the history of libraries, the deep history of libraries, each of which tells a slightly different story. Some of them are stories that take us very far back in that history, and some of them are fairly recent stories. The 6 scenarios are the notion of the library as a mausoleum, as a place of communion between the living and the dead, what we call the living mausoleum. These are all future scenarios. So what would that kind of deep storage function of libraries look like in a future where we have not only the challenges of traditional forms of deep storage, but also the digital as something that has to be documented and stored and has to be ensured an afterlife so that it can be brought alive in a space of communion. The second is what we call the neo-cloister, which looks to these sorts of monastic models of libraries as working libraries, libraries that play a kind of central role in propagating practices of reading that are associated with the process of the democratization of libraries themselves. They're the increasing degrees of access to ordinary people with the growth of literacy, but also the growth of political institutions that support the dissemination of literacy. Ideas that go everywhere, they extend all the way from notions of outreach kinds of libraries, like the kinds of mechanics institutes and all of those forms of popular working class libraries that were meant often as either intended for purposes of evangelization or for worker education, or subscription libraries, very common practice particularly in Northern Europe in the 19th century, all the way to pop-up libraries, to the idea of a concept of the library that really embraces provisionality instead of long-term conservation as a core value. So you can see in this skeleton that I just presented to you that there's a kind of temporal scale in the sequencing of the argument. What we try to really suggest is not only that the library has never been one thing, nor have the contents been one stable kind of thing, but rather that there's always been a proliferation of possibilities, of ways of combining these different features, and that the scale of that goes from very long-term conservation as a core value to immediate satisfaction of social needs is an enriching feature, not something that we should view as somehow compromising the nature of the library. And therefore, the book is, in a sense, the so chapter, which is the concluding portion of the backbone of the argument, is really a kind of argument for mixing and matching. That we think a lot of the creative process of reinventing, reimagining a great institution like the library is really about thinking about libraries for what, for whom, thinking not so much of the library with a capital L, but rather, and therefore naturalizing a single type, but really thinking about ways, productive ways, to mix and match and to think against some of those tendencies in our own thought, to naturalize a particular moment in that history as if it were the only answer to the question of what a library is, can be, and how it can serve a community. The book ends with a visual essay, like the others, which is called Cold Storage, and it is a visual essay on a library that falls somewhere in those scenarios between the database and the Accumul library, which is called the Harvard Depository. The Harvard Depository is the storage facility for the Harvard libraries, and it's where most of the books and documents that make up Harvard's library system actually live. And it is not a library for people, it's a library for machines. It is a storage system run by a database where the human agents who are involved in retrieving books and searching for books, placing books that are newly arrived, engage in these acts, working essentially in the service of a database that issues requests, processes returns, locates objects by size, not by any kind of taxonomy that has to do with, it's a taxonomical system based on size. And that world, which is literally a kind of database architecture, in other words, we often talk about database architecture in the development programming world. This is literally an architecture made for a database. It physicalizes aspects of a database, the way a database thinks, the way it functions, along certain lines of value, which have to do with the cost of space. And it is a structure devoted to the long-term conservation of books. So it is literally a refrigerator where, with certain humidity conditions and so forth, that have to be perfectly maintained. And one of the interesting features of this, a little bit like the Accumul library, which is why we threw that publication in the middle, is that the building will not be able to last more than 75 to 100 years, because it's a typical crappy, big box store, cinder block building. And even perfectly maintained, it will not make it past a century. But the temperatures and the climate conditions and the way in which the objects are preserved is designed to ensure that they will last 400 to 500 years. So that paradox of what it is to imagine a world where we're no longer talking about the kind of dreams of the universal library that holds everything, that preserves, that guarantees, like the kind of living mausoleum scenario, if you like, that the dead will always be present and available to commune with the living, outside of time in a sense, to a model where we have this very interesting, rich, kind of almost paradoxical sense of long-term preservation, but in a building, in an envelope that itself embodies evanescence, the need for constant relocation, if you like. I think it crystallizes in a way some of the tensions that we're really interested in exploring in the book. So that final chapter is, and this brings me back to where I started, is itself actually the text that leads in, and I'll show it to you in a second, is actually the screenplay for a documentary film, which we're finishing right now, which is a portrait of the Harvard Depository, which is not a visitable structure. So we're trying to actually allow people to experience what one very surprising way a library can look today. And this is, by the way, this is a structure that was built in 1986, so it's not exactly, if we wanted to go to the cutting edge, we could have found a robotic retrieval system, like at the Mansueto Library in Chicago, but we really wanted to show something different, which is how this story of the database and its invasion, if you like, of our collective imagination of libraries actually has a deeper history. It has a longer history. It didn't take the personal computing revolution to bring that about. That these transformations in storage systems and retrieval systems and discovery systems is part of a longer term process that really requires a different set of attitudes. So this is what the page structure of this book looks like. You can see it moves across a number of different sorts of formats between these micro formats and longer term ones. And the visual essay, that's the splendid architecture of the Harvard Depository right in that corner. Just, kind of Walmart, not, actually worse than Walmart maybe. And these are the micro essays that come into being. So to take, in other words, at a fine-grained level, the objects that make up the universe of the library, this container that is itself constituted, defined by its contents. And here's just one example. We look at different artifacts, like the bookshelf, for example. When we think today of what is our normative idea of the library, of course, the model that we have all, to one degree or another, naturalized in our minds is this idea of the library that's built around a stack structure. But this was an invention of the 19th century. Literally, at the end of the 19th century, when these kinds of systems, like this is the famous Sneed stack system, when those systems were developed, they were the high technology of the late 19th century, based on fabrication methods that were relatively recent, and they became they were not only created for purposes of increasing the density and the flexibility of storage, but they were also construction systems. In the case of libraries like the Library of Congress, the wing that was built in the late 19th century, the case of New York Public, the case of Widener Library, those are libraries built on their stack systems. The stack system supports the roof. You could take all the walls out around the periphery of the building, and the building would stand, because the stack system is literally the building. And that is not just a conceit. I think what that suggests is the way in which this notion that a library is a storage system for books, objects on a certain scale, with certain conditions of access, and that around it are built a periphery of services, a reference room, a reading room, study spaces of a certain kind, that sort of model that has become the kind of norm, that then even small scale, large scale, all libraries in a sense are built around some variation on that. That is largely a kind of model that got constituted in the second half of the 19th century, became naturalized, became ubiquitous in the course of the first half of the 20th century. But we're clearly moving, and people have been thinking about storage systems and shelving systems as a design feature, of course, in all kinds of creative and imaginative ways. And even this classic bookshelf-centric, stack-centric model itself served what, in fact, were much more hybrid, much more mixed set of functionalities. So what we try to do in these microhistories is really the basic game of these windows is, on the left you have some kind of classic moment that has become naturalized in the history of libraries, and on the right you have drawn, usually from the Library of Patents, really fantastic or crazy or strange modifications that people have been imagining, sometimes going back, sometime actually, in this case, one of those shelving systems is a shelving system by Friedrich Kiesler, actually, from the manifesto, the co-realism manifesto, with the idea of changing our human interactions, of course, with storage, creating a model of storage activation that's a more dynamic one than that old stack-centric sort of model. We try to look at this in terms of, again, with these two perspectives, all of these fine-grained analyses kind of replicate the larger argument that the book is making around a series of objects, like the carrel, for example. This is a good example. So carrels go back to particularly medieval monastic-type library environments. It was a fundamental piece of furniture because the act of reading was closely associated with the act of copying. Transcription was fundamental to medieval practices of reading. So the carrel was a kind of study that was crucial to the kind of scriptorium definition of libraries, and therefore, the positioning of books, but also writing surfaces side by side, the ability to orchestrate information in a certain way. It's a kind of interface design, if you like, that's concretized through a particular way of designing a piece of furniture. And then we have, this is for Melville Dewey's, one of his patents. He owned thousands and thousands of patents for pieces of library furniture. A kind of modern industrial era carrel, right, where you could have a much less hierarchical relationship between the working surface, which you would expect in a classic carrel to be extremely static. Now you can actually move things up and down, have different kinds of hierarchies. You know, that's a more flexible interface design, if you like. And then on the opposite side, of course, you see various attempts to try to imagine alternatives, highly portable ones, new kinds of workstations. But the point is here to suggest that there's a long-term kind of history of experimentation. These are not, you know, sort of, again, static or stable constructs. They're very much part of larger systems of belief, fantasy, expectation, and need. This is one that interests us a lot in Library Test Kitchen. Several student projects have been focused on trying to do something with the carrel to try to think about, for example, since as we are increasingly moving to models of research and curation of information that move across the analog-digital divide, a lot of the work that used to go on in a visible context, where you could see what people were doing when they put things together, when they assembled objects on a desk or on a shelf, goes into hiding, so to speak. That social dimension of knowledge making becomes increasingly invisible. You can't see what somebody's doing on their desk, their virtual desktop, the way you can see the way they assemble artifacts in a physical desktop. So the idea of thinking about this little micro essay ends with the notion of curation stations, of the carrel as a curation station. What if we could create forms of visibility to that kind of work that moves across those divides, that allows us to feel a sense of participation in the community of knowledge making and sharing? And how would we design that into the physical environment in ways that are practical? Those are the kinds of questions that we're interested in here. We look at copy stations. Copying has been a defining feature of library spaces as far back as one can go. The librarian themselves is a kind of figure, the library card, reference desks, and so forth. Another feature of the book that's kind of fun is that, so given the fact that the Library Test Kitchen was this kind of incubator for this very book, the book really came out of it, we thought it would be interesting that a lot of the ideas that students, participants in the design studios had come up with, far-fetched or realistic, seemed like good provocations for getting us out of our normal habits of thinking about the design of knowledge-rich environments and spaces. We thought it would be fun to have them integrated into the book somehow, but not just into the book, actually. The provocations also exist as a card deck. So people who are involved in design exercises can use them. It's a playable card deck. You can play bridge with it if you want. But the idea was to take these little ideas, some of which are rather practical ideas, some of which, as I said, are just provocations. Literally, we call them the provocations in the book. They exist as a marginal, sort of like a little flip book, so you can look at them. And to have that choral voice of people thinking from very different points of view about all those different scales as a sort of sidebar to the conversation about the deep history of libraries and speculative thinking about their future seemed like a rich, not just provocation, but a way of enriching a bigger process, again, rather than just being a product. I just wanted to give this one example because Cold Spots, this one turned out to be a very successful one. So one of the students in the design studio had this idea that it would be interesting, like now that the world is a hotspot, like this was not a problem that we had 10 years ago. Like you used to, I don't know if you do the same as I used to have to go around with my laptop in some places trying to find a signal. And now, of course, wireless networks, microwave networks reach just about everywhere, including natural landscapes. You can be out in the middle of a state park and you've got a cell phone signal. So the question is, if libraries, one of the traditional functions of libraries is to be a place of contemplation. be a place where another kind of community, another kind of conversation, that kind of experience, quality of experience or attention happens that isn't that of being networked to this endless, infinite set of possible immediate connections, but to establish different connections. So what does a cold spot look like? So this is the proposal. The cold spot, initially, Ben Brady, who is the architecture student who worked on this idea as his thesis project, he developed a kind of, it's the antithesis of a phone booth. So it's like a phone booth type structure, except it has paint on it that resists microwave signals. So it has to be plugged in so that the wood surface becomes a shield against. And it's a kind of contemplation space. And I don't have a picture of the actual artifact that he created, but this actually got picked up by Fast Company and several online magazines because I think it prompted an interesting conversation about connectivity in its relation to quality experiences, work with information, with data, with data resources. And it's led to a number of other experiments with the idea of trying to imagine how we might develop library architectures that have programmable degrees of connectivity or disconnectivity as a feature of their design, or maybe developing devices. One of the experiments we tried was with a device that's also in the provocations called the Ice Cube, which is a portable device with its own battery pack that has a scrambler on it. They're actually illegal, but it's interesting. Okay, so a librarian could actually reprogram parts of a building depending on the activities that are going on, moving this object and disconnecting people essentially, but even disconnecting parts of networks. There's no reason why you have to, it's not an either or proposition. You can decide you want to filter certain portions of the universe of microwave communications and leave others intact. You can filter for social media. You can, so the question of how you design those kinds of quiet spaces, I think, is a really interesting design question. And again, we don't offer answers. We offer provocations and propositions, but we think it's a design conversation that should be a conversation, of course, with librarians and professionals, but also with user communities, also with a whole world of users, in fact, maybe who don't even use libraries. It's a fundamentally a conversation about society and about culture and about how we want to animate our institutions. So I mentioned the scenarios in the broadest possible terms. I'd be happy to talk about any of them in detail. We begin with the most consecrated ones. The living mausoleum is, again, the space that's associated with the deep storage functions of libraries, the notion that library architecture should also, in a sense, communicate that message of deep storage, of devotion to sustaining a deep and sustained conversation between the present and the past, and the notion that that conversation is a form of, in a sense, activation also of that past. And of course, that notion is a notion that goes certainly back to the libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon, where the very monarchs who were the sponsors, if you like, of the Museion, which was what the Library of Alexandria was called, were buried there. It was a place of burial. The scrolls were right side by side with the bodies of the rulers. To the database, which of course is this emerging and dominant element in the conversation today, and all the way through to pop-up libraries of different kinds. And as I said, we close with cold storage, that's a picture of the Harvard repository taken from the satellite. And what I thought I'd do here, by way of sort of transitioning to the conversation, to a kind of discussion, is to show you it's a rough cut still, so I won't vouch for the soundtrack and the color balancing or anything, but show you the first 4 or 5 minutes of the documentary that we're making, which is part, I want to position this a little bit because this book is, not only is the last chapter of it kind of a down payment on this documentary, which you're going to hear right now. The voiceover is literally the text that leads into the visual essay, but also the The documentary sits in what we like to call a database documentary. In other words, what you see is a kind of linear documentary that's actually embedded in a much richer universe where all the stuff that's on the cutting floor, a whole series of forms of mapping, documentation, a kind of living archive, if you like, of the Harvard Depository is created so that you as a user can not only visit that place, but you can see things about it that even the people who work there don't really fully understand or own. Like the way the temperature control systems work, or the way there's a complete sound mapping of the space too, the way machine noises shape your experience of the environment, the data flows in and out of the space, the little secrets that it contains, as well as many, many other things. So what you're seeing is a piece, again, of a larger multi-channel project with a database documentary as the sort of overall container, the book as a kind of projection, and about the film, let me just say one short prefatory thing, and that is that in 1957, the great French, recently deceased director Alain Resnais made a 25-minute documentary on the National Library of France in Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale, entitled Toute la mémoire du monde, All the World's Memory. And if you've never seen this film, it's a beautiful film and a kind of homage to a vision of the library, this library that we would call in our book the Universal Library. It's the National Library, the central hub. Every book that is ever published in French is supposed to end up at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The reading rooms are placed literally alongside the storage system, which is at the core of the building. It's a building that brings together, it's a kind of cathedral, a kind of monument to this, what we call the mausoleum model of the library. And our documentary is actually a literal reshooting of that film. So you will see that there's black and white segments that are actually borrowed from Resnais's film. It's a shot-by-shot reshooting, but under completely different conditions in the context of a library that's not for readers, but a library that's about inventorying and storage systems, and the way in which the database actually is the mind that holds together this institution. So it's a film about the differences, what happens from 1957 to right now. And last but not least, it's also borrowed from a very cheesy 1990s VHS documentary, a kind of advertising documentary that Harvard made to convince other partners to lease space inside the Harvard Depository. So you'll see a little bit of this cut together. It's not fully explained here, but maybe it'll give you a good enough sense. Let's see if I can get it to fire up. That's the, no, it doesn't like that. Okay. No, it's my computer just misbehaving. Okay, I'm going to show it from somewhere else because I suspect this much. Okay, here we go. All right, this one.
The Harvard University library system contains over 90 libraries. However, these libraries do not have adequate shelf space. Many of the materials in our collection, especially the more fragile ones, may have a shortened lifespan. To deal with the overflow and to provide a secure, climate-controlled environment, Harvard University has built a remote storage facility, the Harvard Depository.
Parce que leur mémoire est courte, les hommes accumulent d'innombrables transferts.
Because their memory is short-lived, humans accumulate an infinity of memory aids. Confronted with the teeming depositories that result panic sets in. They fear being trampled by information, submerged beneath heaps of words and data. So to ensure their freedom, they erect formidable fortresses, faraway stockhouses, libraries that can't be read except by machine minds. One such bastion is a high-density facility known as the Harvard Depository, or HD, wherein reside 9 million books, pamphlets, posters, papers, films, magnetic tapes, photographs, LPs, and microforms. 9 million items and counting.
And counting. 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
With its 127,000 square feet of storage and 3 million linear feet of shelving, the HD represents the heart of the Harvard University library system.
So when I tell people about I try to say that it's mostly like, insane razor last stop when they load up the out into the crate and then it's shut and wrapping it up and they start to push it down through the aisle into storage, and as he's going down the aisle it hands out, you see it's just bigger and bigger and just kind of keeps going on, and like feel it down the aisles and how vast it really is.
It is, however, a dislocated heart. Invisible to patrons, it is situated 25 miles from campus atop a remote hill within a guarded compound near Harvard's primate labs. The HD is an analog server farm, comparable to the digital server farms the university maintains in other off-site locations, except for the fact that it mostly delivers physical packets of information via a pipeline of vans that shuttle back and forth to campus 4 times a day at approximately 60 miles per hour, more than 11 million times slower than the speed traveled by digital packets. But long before the advent of digital storage, libraries contended with the challenge of keeping too much information in too little space. Built in 1986, the HD's origins stretch back to the turn of the 20th century, when Harvard's president, Charles William Eliot, first began advocating not for a crematorium for dead books, but only a receiving tomb. Neither am I proposing that the bibliophile or the antiquarian should be deprived of his idols, wrote Eliot, only that his access to them should be made convenient and attractive. Seven storage modules have been built to date. 8 additional slots remain available to accommodate the continuation of the human record. To avoid bursting at its seams, the HD neither digs deeper into the soil nor reaches higher into the heavens. It sprawls.
It's a much bolder hilltop than it used to be. Every module displaces a quarter acre, half acre of trees. Fire code keeps them back from the building by a certain distance. It's still quiet though. When we rode in this morning, there was a bunch of those big turkeys, skulking around people's cars.
Like other time capsules of its kind, the depository sets out to subjugate time as it compresses space. The vault must remain sealed, except when a tug on the pull chain opens up a momentary passage between time and eternity. Decay must be held at bay. Even if some works will be consulted only once, they must be preserved. That's the rule. A massive cooling system maintains an average of 50 degrees Fahrenheit with 35% average humidity, a dynamic balance responsive to seasonal change. Paper, leather, and parchment are living materials, aging whether we're reading them or not. darkened bay inhabited by film and video collections, the air is even colder. For while we experience these media as unchanging records of moments, their emulsions and magnetized surfaces are continually overwritten by time.